If you've been struggling with Path of Exile 2 or you're just looking for the best way to level up quickly, kill bosses, or progress through the starting campaign, then this is probably the best build you can play right now. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HTM here with my favorite starting build right now in Path of Exile 2, starting as the Witch class. The Witch right now in POE2 is absolutely insane when it comes to clearing out enemies, as well as easily defeating bosses with minimal effort involved. Just throw out your minions and watch everything die. That being said, there is a bit of setup involved here, especially when it comes to leveling up early and unlocking the right skills and passives, which is why I wanted to make this video to get you through the first few acts and off to the best start possible. As always, timestamps will be provided below if you need to skip around or rewatch a section, and let's jump right into it. But first, let's talk about skills, and we'll be going in order here from the very start of the game. And don't worry, everything I go over here is also in the written guide. If you need to review, link for that is in the description. So once you wash up on the shore in Path of Exile 2, you'll quickly get access to your first wand, which, lucky enough for you, also comes with a starting spell called Chaos Bolt. This is just your basic ranged attack, and it does well enough at the start of the game to deal some small damage to enemies, but you won't keep this for very long as you'll have some better options very soon. In fact, I wouldn't even bother slotting support gems for this skill, as it will quickly get replaced by something better. But within the starting area as well, you should also get another weapon type called a scepter, which you'll most likely use some form of for the entire campaign. That's because these rattling scepters specifically grant you access to your first minion called the Skeletal Warrior, and these guys are just too handy to give up. They serve as your basic meat shields, tanking enemies for you, and helping to draw their attention away so you can remain in the back line and cast from safety. And now Skeletal Warrior minions do not do very much damage, especially at the start of the game, but again, damage is definitely not their focus. You'll be having them charge into battle ahead of you, absorb damage, and eventually sacrifice them to empower your other, more damage-focused minions. Now, as I mentioned, using a Rattling Scepter will summon 2 warrior minions for you at the start, which are completely free and do not cost spirit. Most minions do cost quite a bit of spirit each to maintain, so getting 2 warriors without using any spirit at the start of the game is a big bonus. You'll want to take advantage of that. So make sure to keep using some type of Rattling Scepter and look for better versions as upgrades. Plus, scepters usually give spirit as a baseline, which is going to let you summon more minions of other types once you get the right skill gems. And one other point on minions before we move on is that most of your standard minion types, including the warrior, are self-reviving. That means you don't need to cast them or do anything special when they die. They will just revive on their own after a short period of time, and you can make them revive faster with specific passives. But in terms of support gems for the warrior minion, you'll eventually want to work to improve their overall tankiness. So gems like Meat Shield, which specifically give these minions more life at the cost of damage, is a good starting option. And later on, you can also slot in something like Elemental Army, which is going to increase their elemental resistances. Next up, you'll get access to the Unearth skill as well, which summons bones out in front of you, damaging enemies and raising corpses to create bone construct minions. This is going to be your first option to deal some actual AoE damage on the Witch, so it's not terrible to start with, but it doesn't do a lot of damage on its own. Instead, what I prefer to do with this skill early is get a good support gem for crowd control and slot that in. The pin support gem, for example, is actually quite nice with Unearth, as it will have a chance to root all enemies in front of you, helping you take less damage and control your enemies more easily. You can even ramp this up further with the Lockdown support gem, which just helps to build up that pin status effect faster. But again, this is really just for the early game, as you'll get some better options fairly soon, and honestly, your damage will quickly be so insane that you probably won't need much crowd control on this build, as stuff just dies so quickly. Speaking of which, the first offensive minion you'll probably unlock as a Witch is called the Skeletal Sniper. This minion can be a strong option, especially single target against bosses, where you can apply some interesting dot and debuff effects early on with the right support gems. For example, you could use the Envenom support gem to have your sniper apply poison, and with poison you can also combine the Corrosion support gem to break enemy armor. So the sniper can be useful early on, as I said, and it also gets cheaper to maintain with further skill upgrades. I believe it goes from like 90 spirit down to 50, and eventually around 30 spirit to maintain. So sometimes this minion can fill in a gap in your team if you don't have enough spirit for something better, like a Skeletal Arsonist, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, it doesn't hurt to have at least one sniper early on, and if you have some extra dexterity, you can buff it with those support gems that I mentioned. One of the best sources of damage on the Witch early is not a minion at all. It actually comes from another specific wand type called a Bone Wand, and that is the skill Bone Blast. Now, I personally love this skill when starting out on the Witch class because not only does it have solid DPS, often more than Chaos Bolt, which we got earlier, but it also has a small AoE radius, which means you can easily hit 2 to 3 enemies at the same time with this skill while your warriors are tanking and while you're rooting enemies in place with Unearth. So the skill just fits really well. But with the right support gems, as I said, Bone Blast just wrecks enemies in the early game, which is going to be super useful for us because your minions really aren't strong enough yet. So you're going to need that extra punch from another offensive skill, and Bone Blast just fits that role perfectly on this build. So to buff that skill even further, you can use the support gem called Arcane Tempo. This is going to give it 25% more cast speed. More casts is going to equal more damage, obviously. And then you can also apply Concentrated Effect. This is going to help the skill deal 40% more area damage, though the area will be slightly smaller. But once you start getting level 3 gems, this build gets much better, including a lot more damage potential brought in by the Skeletal Arsonist minion. This minion, in my opinion, is much better for leveling up because of their AoE potential versus the Sniper, as we said, which is single target. And we can expand that AoE for the Arsonist even further with the right support gems. So at this point, I would drop my Sniper minions and try to get at least 2 Arsonists, and then you can just spam Unearth to root everything in front of you, and then just let your Arsonists blow up everything. Of course, it does get a lot better with the right supports, as I said, and you can drop all of your dex supports from your snipers and instead get the Scatter Shot gem, put that on your Arsonist so that they now throw out 3 bombs instead of 1. And for the second support gem, I recommend Martial Tempo here to improve their attack speed by another 25%. Another quick note on the Arsonist is that they do actually have an active effect which you can use on low health minions to explode them for bonus damage, which can be a nice option for faster clearing, especially between groups, as you can like blow up a warrior minion, for example, or your bone constructs for some quick extra damage. Another powerful skill you can unlock with a level 3 gem is called Bone Cage. This is going to be the preferred CC option once you unlock it. That's because this skill does pin enemies by default without having to use a support gem for that. And it also builds up the pin status effect faster, so you should have no problem rooting basically everything using this skill. Even bosses usually only take 2 to 3 casts at most. And I also like how you can set up your cage ahead of time so that once enemies walk into it, they automatically get pinned. So it just plays better than Unearth does as a crowd control ability. But don't get me wrong, you can still use Unearth in combination with this skill if you want to, especially if you want to keep using those bone constructs. But by this point, I found I didn't really need it anymore. And once I put Bone Cage into the rotation. Now, in terms of gems, I recommend moving Lockdown here for even more pin and then Magnified Effect for an even bigger radius. But so far, this build is still pretty basic, and we need a Spirit Gem to unlock its true potential. You're going to get your first Spirit Gem around level 12 in Act 1 from the zone called Freythorn. Here you'll need to beat the final boss called King of the Mists and then crush the Gem Bloom Skull that you earn to get a permanent plus 30 spirit for your character and your first Spirit Gem. So Spirit Gems unlock spirit skills, which are essentially like auras, which stick with your character. And here you can unlock Raging Spirits, which is actually found under the Elemental or the Sorceress category, and that's a unique form of fire minion, which is incredibly strong on this build. Raging Spirit has this unique mechanic where it's summoned with a fire spell, like Flame Wall, for example, from the Sorcerer's kit, but it's incredibly strong, as I said, because you can summon up to 10 of these guys, 5 per fire spell cast. So you'll need to cast that Flame Wall ability twice to get the full effect. But the great thing is that enemies ignore these Raging Spirits, and they are insanely fast. So it's essentially free damage that just floats around you, attacks enemies, as long as you keep casting that Flame Wall, which we'll talk about next. But in terms of support gems here, you'll unlock much more damage on these in the later game, but for now in Act 1, I'm recommending using Fire Infusion for 25% extra flame damage. And speaking of Flame Wall, you'll obviously need to unlock this spell also to get the full potential of this build, so make sure to pick up this one as well. Now, this is good not only for summoning your Raging Spirits, but also for the bonus damage that it adds to projectiles. You're probably familiar with this if you've played the Sorcerer's class. So you can see on the tooltip here that bonus damage is applied to any projectile that flies through the wall, and this can even empower your other minions, like your Arsonist, for example. So there's a lot of synergy here, which is really powerful. Just make sure you keep leveling up this skill as well, because that bonus keeps going up and up. But in terms of support gems on Flame Wall, I usually start with Fortress to expand the area of the Flame Wall into a circle so you can hit more enemies and hit them more consistently. And you can even use the Spell Cascade support gem if you want to create even more flame circles on the ground. But by now, most of the pieces for this beginner build are in place in terms of skills, and you should notice the difference immediately with how fast this build can just clear through the campaign zones. One other skill you might be interested in early on is called Pain Offering. This one sacrifices one of your nearby minions to empower the rest, giving them 30% increased attack speed and cast speed, as well as much more damage. So this can be super effective to use once you have lots of Arsonists, for example. Just sacrifice one of your warriors, and then their damage and their attack speed is going to go up quite a bit. And to increase the duration of that buff, you can also plug in the Persistence gem right away. That's going to give an extra 30% skill duration boost. So how do you put it all together? Well, it's really simple. As I explained with this setup, you basically should have your 2 warriors out at all times with this build. If you're running the Scepter, those minions are free. Then you use your Spirit to summon as many Arsonists as possible, at least like 2 to 3 to start with. Next, you can use Bone Cage to root enemies in place if needed, and then cast 2 Flame Walls. Remember to cast it twice, so that you summon your maximum of 10 Raging Spirits. This is really all you need for damage. And your Raging Spirits combined with the Arsonists, combined with the bonus that you get, bonus damage from Flame Wall, that's literally going to destroy everything. If you want to, you can play more active. You can use that Bone Blast skill from your wand on tougher enemies like bosses and rares, as it does have a nice stun component built in, so you can stun those bigger enemies if you want. But other than that, just make sure to use Pain Offering for larger pulls, where you want to increase damage and cast speed of your minions. Remember, you'll have to sacrifice a minion, so ideally cast that on a warrior. But yeah, that's it. Really simple and extremely effective. All right, so let's switch things up a little bit, talk about gear, and starting with what I think is probably the most important pieces you want to pick up on this beginner setup, and that's going to be your wand and your scepter. The scepter probably the most important, because remember, that's going to summon those free warrior minions for us. And there's actually some really good buffs that you can get on the scepter itself. We're talking about spirit. Usually these have 100 base spirits, so that's another reason why you'll want to get them. But you can get additional bonuses, so increased spirit, for example, 14% on this one. That's a nice bonus as well. But this one also has plus level of all minion skills, great bonus there. And as well, allies in your presence deal increased damage. This one has 49% increased damage. What does allies mean? Well, basically that is your minions. So all of my minions on this build have about 50% bonus damage just because I'm running this one scepter. So those are some things I would look out for. Again, increased spirit, increased minion skills, and increased ally damage. Talking about your wand next, not quite as important. This will be stuff like, bonus spell damage. This is what gives us that Bone Blast ability, which I think is still really good in the early game. But other bonuses here like increased intelligence or especially mana per enemy killed. Those are going to be some nice bonuses to pick up on your wand as well. In terms of other gear pieces that are important, we always talk about, your boots. In Path of Exile 2, getting that increased movement speed is really helpful early on just to make the levels go by a little bit quicker. And this one also has intelligence, plus bonuses to energy shield recharge, so it's pretty decent. And I'll just mouse over a couple of my other pieces here so you can see what I'm using. Basically anything with energy shield, that's going to be a big priority on this build in terms of, your defensive stats, especially when it comes to your bigger pieces like your robe, for example. You can run up to 2 runes on this. And if you get the physical runes, the ones that give you plus bonus to armor, evasion, and energy shield, you can get some pretty high energy shield values even in the early game. So that's what I would recommend you focus on for your main body pieces, like the robe, as I said, and the your helmet slot as well is going to be an important piece for that. And then just all the usual +2 intelligence, +2 maximum life, maximum mana, +2 spirit. The armor pieces and jewelry that you can get can have spirit bonuses on those as well. Keep an eye out for spirit bonuses. Any increase you can get to spirit is going to be a nice addition to this build. But that's pretty much it in terms of the basic gear pieces to make this build work. Let's go ahead and talk about the passive skill tree next. Again, just for the early game, starting campaign, I would recommend that you start really with some defensive passives here to your energy shield. So that's going to be taking the right side of the witch tree to begin with. First few nodes here for energy shield, +10 to maximum, +10 to maximum, 15% increased max energy shield, 15% increased, and then 30% increased max shield +10 intelligence. That's going to give you a really nice defensive start. I still have this active because I think it's going to be a nice addition to all those energy shield armor pieces that we're picking up, just to increase that bonus a little bit. But that's really going to help at the start of the game to make your build be able to absorb more damage, because that's probably your main problem that you're going to get is just basic survival on the witch class when you're starting out. Now, once you have a couple of survival nodes in place, you can then go and get your offensive passives. So spell and minion damage, really good. This is going to increase, the damage of your wand skills as well as the damage of your minion. 8% increase to both here, and we're just going to keep going up that skill tree. 8%, 8%, 8%, and then 16% increased spell damage, minion damage, and 10 to intelligence. That's a really nice start there. And then you're going to continue working your way up to those extra spell and minion damage nodes. 10% increased minion damage here, 15% increased minion damage here, as well as increased attack and cast speed, and then more spell damage and minion damage here. From that point, you have a couple different directions you can go for the witch class. I'm going to recommend you follow and travel up here, upper right, to this area where there's a lot of different minion nodes you can pick up. Some of them are really strong. Revival. Minions revive 15% faster. Minions have 40% increased max life. You have a lot more increased damage here, movement speed, accuracy, plus a lot more increased damage. So I do pick up most of this tree right here. Next, I think that's a really good place to go. Once you're done there, you can actually come back and get some more defensive passives. So we have more max life for minions, 15% revive, and then some nice energy shield bonuses here as well. 28% increased max shield, for example. From there, we're going to start traveling back to the left side of the tree, and here's kind of where I am right now. And a little hint here is just put the word minion or minions into your passive filter, and it'll highlight everything that has to do with minions on the passive skill tree. So this helps a lot because almost everything that has to do with minions on this build, we want to get it eventually. But like I said, from here, you can either start going downwards. Here we have a couple, about 4 increased minion damage nodes here. So that'll give you about 45% bonus minion damage just from these 4. And then you'll want to start working your way into this circle here. This has a lot more attack speed, resistances, increased life, area of effect, increased damage. Yeah, so these are really good. You're going to want to pick those up next. And eventually traveling all the way to the edge of the skill tree here, you're going to want to get into minion damage through the Lord of Horrors, as well as the Sentinel nodes over here for more increased damage as well. Yeah, that's it in terms of passive skill tree. I'll have more information on this in the written guide as well. You want to check that out and follow along. But that's going to wrap things up in terms of this beginner build for the Witch class in Path of Exile 2. Hope you guys found this helpful. If you did, do me a favor and crush that like button. It absolutely helps out the channel and lets YouTube know to share this video with others. As I mentioned, I have a written guide over on my website as well. That's hacktheminotaur.com. Over there, I'll have everything there listed in order in terms of the skills, support gems for each skill, recommendations for gear and the passive tree, how to play the build. Basically, everything is there that you're going to need to get started. And I have other beginner guides for Path of Exile 2 over there as well. So make sure to check that out. Link is in the description. But as always, I hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there. And I will see you around in the next video.